Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session today. It's lovely to be in the cool, is it not? And we have a cool guest for you today. This is George Osborne. My name is Anne McElvoy. I'm senior editor at The Economist and a broadcaster for the BBC and a columnist for the Evening Standard, which is edited by George Osborne. It only goes to show if you fly about, 3,000-4,000 miles, you can finally get to ask your editor some testing questions. I have to say, Gems, thank you for so much these last few days, but this is exquisite. George Osborne will be known to many of you, of course, as former Chancellor of Great Britain. He stood down from Parliament in 2017. He was Chancellor for 6 years. He was Chancellor for 6 years until the year before, and had one of the highest profiles, really, in the British cabinet at that time. One of the reasons that this all came to an end was, of course, the referendum on Europe, and we'll be turning our attention, I'm sure, to that and to Britain after Brexit, or approaching Brexit, in just a moment. But George, as we're here primarily to talk about education, there'll be a lot of people around at this conference who see finance ministers, which is what you'd be known as if you hadn't been in Britain, as being the ones who hold on to those purse strings when educators are trying to free up money to do great things in schools and higher education. And what was the balance in your mind to the way that you looked at education and indeed how you went about it in your own job?
Well, it's great to be here, interviewed by you, Anne, and I hope you got a job next week.
There's nothing like getting the ground rules out there early, is there?
The primary task I had as the Chancellor, which in Britain is both the kind of finance and budget minister rolled together, was to try and deal with an 11% budget deficit. I mean, that was the central early mission of the government. And within that, there were certain constraints. I mean, we had self-imposed constraints, one of which was that health spending would continue to rise. And that put a lot of pressure on everything else. And it was within that context that, I, relatively speaking, tried to shield education from cuts. So we held spending static in real terms, but of course, in a context of a system that had been used to annual increases. So it felt...
So it was described as a real terms cut, wasn't it?
Well, there was always an argument about whether it was the overall budget or the budget per pupil. And there were more pupils coming into the system, but the overall budget was maintained in real terms. And then when you have that, you have to then make a decision, which is, are you just kind of firefighting? Are you just trying to defend your fiscal policy? Or are you going to try and do something on top of that? And the government, which I was part of, had come in with a mission to reform education. Michael Gove was the education secretary. And probably, I was saying this earlier, the most sort of radical domestic reform we undertook as a government was around education. And I, as the finance minister, I was a kind of unwavering friend and supporter of the Michael Gove education reforms. So I was directing money away from other education priorities, some of which were a legacy of the previous Labour government, and towards his reform programme, which was taking essentially...
That was the Academies programme.
Academies and free schools. So they would get...
More autonomy for schools.
They would get the money, and sort of legacy schemes and things that the previous government had announced essentially, struggled to get the funding. And that was... So I was using the money to back a reform that I believed in, and a cabinet minister who I was friendly with. And, and I think in the context of the economic climate, we did a pretty good job with those reforms.
There's a bit of a paradox, isn't there, about the way the government, the coalition government, which you were a leading member, about its sort of record on education, the way it's perceived. And not to put too fine a point on it, it came down often to personal criticism of David Cameron as Prime Minister and yourself as having been privately educated, sort of posh in British speak when it came to the education system. Do you think that you were kind of part of a generation that was a bit of a tipping point about the perception of those in politics who have benefited from relatively fortunate or even privileged backgrounds? I
suspect it came a bit earlier. I don't think we were the first to face questions about our own education.
Tony Blair.
Yes, I mean, if you remember...
Probably a bit more sharply in your case. Has it been a divine intervention?
Yeah.
Get that back on and answer.
No, I think for some time, Conservatives had been asked about their education background. And actually, it had been a long time since the Conservative Party had been led by someone privately educated. I think the previous person had been Alec Douglas Hume in the early 1960s. So, Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, William Hague, I don't know about Ian Douglas, but Michael Howard, certainly Conservative prime ministers. So, yeah, and obviously David had gone to Eton, which had all sorts of connotations around it. So we did face that question, but I think it was, it's interesting when you think of when we left government and our successors came in, the way they tried to define themselves against us was not so much that we were posh or well-educated, privately educated. It was that we were too metropolitan. That was we're moving away from this metropolitan governing class, and we're going to be a more provincial, a proudly provincial government, the one that replaced us. So I think the education was only part of the mix. It was a kind of, remember the original name given to us was the Notting Hill set, and that was not meant as a compliment.
Do you think now, if you look to the future, do you think that is still the case? I mean, do you think we've seen? I suspect, I'm just putting myself on the line here. I think it probably will be a lot harder for those with privately educated backgrounds possibly to rise to the top of the party, simply because politicians, whatever their party allegiance, are under much more pressure to look and sound like they have more in common with the electorate. Am I right?
I don't think you are, actually, because I think you would have been right a year ago. And that was the sort of assumption, or 2 years ago. I think the assumption was, we were moving to a more egalitarian age. There was more pressure to explain that you had a background that, meant you were better at understanding, ordinary people's lives, basically. Although it's of course, and we could discuss why, but I think I totally reject the idea that it makes you more in touch with people as a politician. But of course, what's happened in Britain, and it's happened in other countries too, but particularly in Britain, is there's been such a sort of shock to the system with Brexit that it's barely mentioned that the leading Conservative contenders to be the next Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, went to Eton. There's no longer anyone's interested in that anymore. And there's barely a kind of examination of the Labour front bench, although occasionally it's pointed out that Jeremy Corbyn, I think, went to a grammar school. But it feels to me like a lot of the rules of the game that I had to live with. And for some of you will have seen the conversation I had with Tony Blair. And, when we were kind of going at each other hammer and tongs, and all those sorts of rules about the fight for the centre, making your sums add up, going out of your way to demonstrate, your in-touchness with the nation, or, in Tony Blair's day, going to the football match. And, all of that seems to have disappeared in British politics. And the whole world I grew up with as a politician has evaporated. Now, whether permanently, I don't know, but it just feels like maybe the issues facing the country now are so big that all feels more trivial.
Feels more trivial. There are two big strands to that. One is austerity in your record as Chancellor, and the other is Brexit. Brexit breaks out. It's like a sort of Tourette's at these things. So let's talk about Brexit in a moment, because its implications and your own stance on it, which has been very strong. But I do just want to stick with your record as Chancellor, which is what I wrote about, or what seemed like most of my a column career, or indeed your record before that, in sort of creating that Cameron-Osborne alliance, which really gave a sort of rebirth to the Conservative Party, and the word modernisation, which we now don't use at all, another thing that seems to have sort of gone from the political rhetoric, at least for the moment. I suppose if you bump into a detractor, which you must now and then, the word that's probably hurled at you with most kind of viciousness is austerity, and the charge being that you starved public services of funding for an ideological reason. And that in the end it wasn't really worth it, because you didn't really hit the savings targets you intended anyway. What's wrong with that attack?
Well, we actually reintroduced the word austerity into the political lexicon. So it came to be used as a term of abuse or criticism, and came to have lots of connotations. But when it was originally introduced into the back into the kind of Western political discourse. It was introduced by David Cameron and me, and then spread over to the United States. And
was
we
that a mistake?
No, well, I think we were trying to describe the situation we were going to face in government, which was this high budget deficit, these enormously difficult budget pressures we were going to face. And we wanted a program of government that conveyed with it kind of seriousness and prudence and fiscal conservatism. And the word austerity had been used in the 1950s previously and had a kind of slightly old-fashioned bank manager-ish sort of air to it.
And after the financial crash, it seemed like the mood that you
And so we talked about, this was originally in opposition, a new age of austerity, which Britain was facing, and true in other countries too. And then it's not that we had wanted to encounter, when we had originally become the leader of the opposition, David Cameron, myself, the Shadow Chancellor, we were actually talking about well-being, environmental issues. We were trying to take the economics out of the argument, which we'd been, as a party, losing against Labour. And it was really the financial crash that came several years into the period when we were running the party, but not the country. And that really forced us to face up to these difficult decisions and try and frame them in the terms of a kind of long-term plan. And we know that a lot of the decisions we took would have been taken by my predecessor, Alistair Darling, because in his memoirs he says, I would have increased VAT, I would have cut welfare spending. So he, essentially almost anyone facing the situation that we faced would have undertaken a period of a fiscal constraint.
But of course you could have backed off earlier, couldn't you? Because some countries chose more stimulus, and that's one of the biggest arguments in economics. But
I would argue
that.
Well, look, we were always constrained by what was politically possible, but I was very fearful that the country was going to face a funding crisis. At the time when we first said this, people thought we were exaggerating. And in the first 6 months as Chancellor, Greece collapsed, Ireland collapsed, Portugal collapsed. And people say, oh, well, we weren't in the euro and we had our own currency. That's true, but there was also a failed gilt auction when we didn't sell our debt.
So you were worried?
We were very worried about that, and the international markets were very worried. And in the end, if that starts to happen to your country, you can forget about funding your public services. You look at what's happened to the health service in Greece or the education system in Greece. So we were trying to have a serious plan. A lot of it had a lot of it was tax rises. They were after an initial controversy, became less controversial, and the spending restraint was longer lasting. But I would say this: you look back, Britain was then performed over those years better than any other Western economy, and emerged from that period as the strongest of the Western economies, the fastest growing of the G7, the fastest growing of the Western economies in the G20. So, and with record employment. So, I would argue, obviously, that it worked.
And you could be right about that with your chancellors or ex-chancellors now hat on, but at the same time, you might have to concede that it did have an impact on public services, that it's been felt often in places in the country already, not doing so well and couldn't absorb it so well, which then, takes us into the impact of that, and whether voters began to feel a sort of dissatisfaction, which then couldn't be contained when it came to the referendum on EU membership.
Well, I would say that was a consequence of the financial crisis. That once you have a deep financial crisis, which was the second deepest recession in British history after the Great Depression, you are going to have all sorts of impacts on people's living standards and the ability to fund services and incomes and so on. That is an inevitable consequence of a massive, great financial crash. And I think the approach we took maintained confidence in the country and meant we didn't suffer something that was a big feature of my childhood growing up in Britain, which was mass unemployment. We did not, and if you can imagine the last 10 years in Britain, and this would be true in other countries too, if you'd had mass unemployment on top of all the other pressures on spending. Nor do I really accept that, I think because of the reforms we undertook and because there was quite a lot of, bluntly, sort of fat in the system to begin with, of overspending, The service, on the actual sort of evidence of education outcomes, health outcomes, crime rates, they all improved over that period. They didn't get worse. But obviously, it would have been nice not to have to have done some of these things. It's not like I took any great sort of pleasure out of it, or it was done for an ideological
And if
reason.
you were in government now, would you be...
Well, I just said there's an interesting...
what would you be saying now?
It was also a different language, which is... So we ended up following an almost identical fiscal path to the Obama administration in terms of the constraint on spending and the shrinking of the state as a percentage of GDP. If you plot them on a graph, they're literally identical. But the Obama administration and sort of Larry Summers, Tim Geithner was all talking the language of stimulus. We were talking the language of austerity. We were actually a bit more generous than our language would have let on. And his policy, partly constrained by the Congress, was tougher on spending than he let on. And it was almost identical.
Your successor, Phil Hammond, as Chancellor, has loosened spending constraints. Anyway, you had loosened a few in your time.
Yes,
we might, you can't take the columnist out. The columnist, I think I've pointed that out over time, and sometimes you agreed and sometimes you didn't. But do you think actually now you would have a complete, would you sort of clean sweep and say that this is now the post-austerity era in Britain?
Well, I think I had already loosened spending a couple of times, and I think in the face of the Brexit result and the pressure that's put on the British economy, I think it was perfectly sensible what Philip Hammond did. I think going forward, obviously the deficit's become a much smaller issue in Britain because the deficit is much smaller. In fact, it's about to be eliminated. And so that you don't have the kind of pressure of some financial, fiscal crisis, funding crisis. But you do have a very high level of debt, as is the case in other countries too. And all the economic studies, mainstream economic studies, suggest that when your debt is close to 100% of GDP, which it is in Britain and in America, your economy is less productive, less successful, is slower growing. And of course, let's imagine, say, a financial crisis hit tomorrow,
You've got
out of the blue,
then
then Britain has got, like some other Western democracies, very little room for manoeuvre in that. And, you would find yourself suddenly your debt approaching 150, 160%, which would be quite alarming.
You mentioned Brexit again there as having changed the entire context of British politics and much beyond. Your own role in the referendum, I mean, you must soul search really about the road to the referendum. Did you ever think it was a good idea?
No, not really.
You heard it here, don't tell anyone. That's a secret. And did you say so strongly?
Yes, I did. I mean, I was against having a referendum. Ironically, the only other person who really supported me was Michael Gove, who was also against having a referendum. But look, I had been a team player. You mentioned earlier the kind of partnership with David Cameron. I was not about to flounce out of the cabinet saying, I'm not going to have this referendum. I made my case for why we shouldn't have one and lost the internal argument, and then thought, right, well, I had a good chance to make my case, but we've got to now live with this decision and I make the best of it. And then when it came to the actual referendum, because I was very fearful of the result, which is one of the main reasons I was against having a referendum, I just, instead of staying silent or kind of staying out of it or thinking about, the best place to maneuver myself, I just threw myself into it and, and paid a political price for that myself.
You paid a political price because when it
Well,
went
because
wrong,
I alienated half the Conservative Party, who weren't best pleased with my efforts, if you remember.
And what do you think about the way that the campaign was conducted? I mean, I know that a lot comes with hindsight, but it did very much feel like a campaign led by elites in government, by the city, by finance, and did it ever really get to grips with the mood in the country? And was that really one of the reasons why it went the way you didn't want it to?
Well, the first thing about it was a referendum on the European issue. I think quite often referendums can be on the popularity of the government or the popularity of the Prime Minister. Or I don't think anyone who lived in Britain at that time, I'm sure quite a few people in this room, would say that the referendum was not about Europe. Now, you might say people didn't know enough or they focused on the wrong issues, but it was a sort of referendum about Europe. Indeed, the expectation was that David Cameron and the government would remain in place even if the verdict was the other way.
Do you think that was ever credible?
Well, I personally didn't privately, nor did David, but you know. And the sort of shock amongst some Conservative colleagues, oh, well, you never told us you were going to resign. I said, well, hold on, the country's just rejected our central economic and security arrangement. You know, where I think there were two things true. I mean, I am personally, I absolutely shoulder responsibility for the campaign and how it's conducted. I think the media, including the broadcasters, did not cover it very well. And I think they treated the whole thing as a kind of internal Conservative Party soap opera. So when Boris Johnson wrote a letter to David Cameron or Michael Gove gave a speech, it was literally, oh my God, you know, this Conservative is attacking this Conservative. And right up until in fact, the BBC News headlines the day before the referendum itself was that Steve Hilton, a former Conservative advisor, was attacking David Cameron. So that was the last thing the BBC had to say on this massive decision that the country faced. That was the sort of first thing. I think second, where we failed was we were not really able to break this link between a concern that a relatively small number of people had around parliamentary sovereignty and their effective link of that to immigration, which is you can't control the numbers, and from that the link to pressure on the NHS or a prospect of additional money for the NHS. And it was those sort of two latter bits of the platform which were very effective, and we didn't really engage with well enough and didn't have a good enough answer to. Because the question I always struggled with in the kind of referendum interviews was, how can you control your immigration numbers if you have free movement of people in Europe? And even though I think a lot of the immigration... But of course you could have had
transitional arrangements which had once been on the table, I think in about 2003-04 under Blair. Angela Merkel wouldn't help. I mean, it's one thing I've sort of brought up with, with the German government. Did you feel that you were kind of left in the lurch? You could have been offered a bit more. I'm using Berlin as a way as the example for sort of Europe, because to this extent it does call the shots.
No, we definitely could have been offered more, and I think that would have helped a lot. But I think, to be fair to the Europeans, they didn't really understand why we're having this referendum. They thought it was a kind of peculiar British obsession, and they thought probably David Cameron would win anyway. So they did make actually very valuable concessions in the way that Britain, as a country not in the euro, would be protected against a majority of European countries that were in the euro when it came to financial decisions and the like. But on immigration, they gave us only essentially an ability to restrict welfare payments to new arrivals. And that, I think, was one of the contributing factors, since that Britain's legitimate demands, or David Cameron's legitimate demands, had been unaddressed.
We should talk about your life now and the way that this is reflected in it. You're editor of the Evening Standard. I'm going to say that's your main job. You've turned out to be very employable, haven't you? You've got lots of other roles.
I'll take that as a compliment.
How many jobs have you got?
I do three main things, and I have a charity. So the three main things: I edit the Evening Standard, I teach at Stanford University in California on a visiting basis, and I advise the American Wall Street firm BlackRock. And then I also have a teaching post at Manchester University, which they were as a sort of honorific thing, which I've gone to Manchester and done several things about. And connected with that, I've also created a charity to promote the north of England, which is where I was an MP, so the Northern Powers Partnership.
I want to have a word about that. That's 5 jobs. Did you notice that? There was inflation there, inflation in the job description. But the Evening Standard does, I know you don't know this, you really are present.
How many jobs do you have, Anne?
I have got, I have a role, George. I have a role as columnist. I work for the columnist. I have a role as your columnist.
Because quite often the people who ask me this question have more jobs than I do.
I have one job and many roles. That's how it works. It's like one of those sort of bits of the divinity.
That's how I feel about it.
And the Standard is you are there. You're there first thing in the morning, which is early at the Evening Standard, and you're on, as we of course to know, you're often on your phone late at night. Has this sort of the ink, the old business of newspaper ink, has really sort of got into your veins, hasn't it?
It's great fun. I mean, it's like, who knew editing a newspaper is such fun? It's first of all, it's a great paper. I mean, I don't just say that because I grew up in London. Anyone who lives in London will know the Evening Standard is the identity of the city. So that's the first thing. Second, it's just fantastically interesting, covering not people focus on the political coverage because of my background, but the arts coverage or the sport coverage I take enormous pleasure in kind of getting to grips with. It's very hands-on. I realized when day I arrived, and I had no journalistic experience at all. Day I arrived, I thought, well, I'm going to take it a bit slowly in the first few weeks. But I chose to sit right in the middle of the newsroom, which you'll have seen in those movies. And I was next to the production director. And, you've got to have a view on this photo, this headline. And after about an hour, I was right into it. Yeah. Yes. I think the final thing is, if you're a former politician, I mean, you've just been asking me lots of questions, quite rightly, about austerity and what I did in 2010 and the budget and, in 20 or whatever, which, of course, I'm very happy to talk about. But there's a sort of sense when you've been a senior politician that you're going to spend the rest of your life answering these questions. Yeah. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life talking about a period of my life from the age of 38 to 45. And I'm very happy to do that, and I'm very proud to have done what I did. But I wanted to do something new. And, of course, you can, it's pretty lucrative just being the ex-finance minister. But I wanted something new and challenging and executive. And that is what editing the paper has given me as well.
And one big stamp that you've put on it, I would say, a couple of things. One is that the leaders, people always say they read newspaper leaders. I think a lot of us kind of read from newspapers know that when there's a great piece of research is when you ask them what they read in the leaders, they then tell you something else that they read elsewhere in the paper. I think that you have stood that on its head. I think people really do read the leaders, partly because they know if they're getting something scoped very quickly on, say, a budget, that they really are getting someone who knows it very well, recently on the inside, which is quite rare, I think almost unique in newspapers, in Britain at least. And the other thing is, of course, it's been fascinating to watch you taking on Brexit and the competence or otherwise of Theresa May, your former cabinet colleague. What made you decide? I mean, you could have just said, well, I'm going to kind of do half and half on Brexit and I'm going to present both sides. But really, you allow a lot of range. But in the end, it's very, very clear that you think it's a disaster and you want to push that through the paper. Explain your reasoning for going about it in that way.
Well, first of all, the paper had an identity which was pretty similar to my politics.
It was very Remain.
So it was pro-Remain. Yeah. It was socially liberal, pro-business. So it's not like I've had to kind of shift it dramatically from where it already was. But I think, it didn't particularly sort of proclaim its opinions loudly. First. Second, I don't think there's any sort of point just doing a job like this and not trying to sort of give the whole thing an authority and a kind of voice. And so I thought, why am I doing this job? Well, it's partly because I've got something to say, and I think the paper's got something to say, and I think the city has got something to say, London. And then, I guess a lot of people were surprised that I had such strident views on, Brexit or the Conservatives or whatever. And they said, well, that's, you're a former Conservative Chancellor, how can you do that? And I get quite a lot of Conservatives come up to me and say, we're not being very fair, or why do you keep going on about Brexit? To which my answer is, I am now a newspaper editor, right? And that is my job. And, if I was always sort of thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to return to politics and I better hedge what I say in this editorial, I just think it would be a bad read. I don't think I would be being true to what the readers deserve. And so I've just approached the job by saying, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability as an editor of a paper, not with someone with a past or a future, just doing this to the very best of my ability. And I think also news is changing. The Evening Standard, when I was growing up, if there was a plane crash or a cabinet reshuffle, you would hear about it first by seeing the Evening Standard vendor shouting out the news and trying to sell you a copy. By the time people come to pick up our paper in the afternoon, they know what they're more likely to know what the main news is if something dramatic has happened, and they've seen it on their phone. And so I think the paper needs to have a bit of attitude.
It needs analytical edge.
It doesn't have to be mean, or it doesn't, it doesn't have to be, shrill. but I think it should have a bit of attitude and be entertaining because it has attitude.
And have you got any more impressed by Theresa May? When you started editing the paper, there was a very strong, argued reason, but basically an attack on her style of leadership. Do you think that things have sort of bedded down a bit there?
Well, I think a lot of first of all, a couple of things that I said about her were actually not said through the paper. They were said on TV programmes, like when I was talking more as a former Chancellor. But, obviously people sort of mix them all up. I would say my observations about the weakness of the government and the likely direction it was going to take the Conservative Party in were broadly borne out by things that happened and are now very widely shared in every other newspaper that previously was...
You're thinking about the general election
yes, and
result,
I said,
a rocky year.
I said, this approach, if the Conservative Party tries to run against Metropolitan Britain will run against it. And then, sure enough, the general election, whilst we did pick up as a party, I'm still a member, some very impressive gains in places like Stoke-on-Trent, which haven't had a Tory MP for 100 years, we lost dozens of seats in Reading, Oxford, Bristol, Brighton, Kensington. And I just think that it's an echo of an argument that David Cameron and I had with Conservatives 15, 20 years earlier about attitudes towards modern Britain. And if the message you're giving out on immigration is essentially hostility to immigrants, don't be surprised if immigrants don't vote for you. And they kind of turn around and say, oh my gosh, we've lost a lot of the British Indian vote. And I was like, really? You're surprised? It was my job, I think, both as a newspaper, to point that out to my readers, to give people the best of my opinion and the advice. And of course, it's a team effort. And we're talking about me on this stage, but it's a team effort, a discussion in the paper about what we think about things.
And you're also, as we said, you don't spare criticism of Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, no one pays. Well, interestingly, we get more reader complaints that I'm anti-Labour than I'm anti-Conservative.
The Corbyn, the sort of Corbyn surge. Of course, he didn't get to win the last election, but it's not impossible that he could be the next Prime Minister, is it?
Well, sure. For a start, he's the leader of the opposition, so
there's that. Yeah, but it's a bit more than that. Isn't it?
Look, I think he's got a reasonable chance. He's leader of the opposition. He's level pegging in the polls. The Conservatives can only lose 7 seats, either to Labour or the Liberal Democrats at the next election, and they're out. And because they're already a minority government, they're trying to win the 4th term, which has only been achieved once since the Second World War. So there are all those reasons why he's got a chance. My own view is that if Labour was led by someone else, they'd have a much better chance. I think Corbyn, for all the interest he generates in the kind of festival crowd and amongst the young voters, which I have to confess has surprised me and is undoubtedly impressive. He is putting off a whole load of people who would love an alternative to kind of hard Brexit, but and feel disenchanted with Conservatives. But look at him and look at the red flag flying above Labour HQ and think, not for me.
What's the probability of Jeremy Corbyn winning the next election?
Well, I know it's going to sound a bit equivocal, but it is sort of 50-50. I think it's, that's what the polls suggest. It's touch and go. Now, I think it would be a much higher chance, as I say, if they didn't have Corbyn and the hard left in charge. But, it is what it is.
Let's take a few questions as we've just gone. Oh, there's so many questions. Right, okay, let's take a couple over here. And I promise on pantomime style, I'll be fair to both sides. If we take 2 to start with and then see how we go, you get your choice of subjects a little bit, George.
I write for a teenage magazine. We've got one of the most expensive university systems in the world. What would you like to see happen to university fees? And secondly, would you go to university now if you were a hard-up school leaver?
Should I just take another question as well? Yeah. Then you can thank you.
Yeah. It's an education conference, and people have different views on how much state funding there should be for education. And it seems to me that because of austerity, that's not something that your government ever had to sort of like make its case for. It's always about necessity. So if we just say, forget for a moment about the crash and the crisis. Government spending as a portion of GDP, I think, was around 45% before the crash. What would you have wanted that figure to be after, say, 10, 15 years of Conservative government?
Well, they're actually related, the two questions. So first of all, I would always recommend that someone tries to go into further education and higher education. One of the things that I'm proudest of doing as Chancellor is lifting the cap on the number of university places in Britain. So I used to face a decision every single year, my decision, not the Education Secretary's, how many people do you let into university this year? Chancellor of the Exchequer. Option 1, 500,000, option 2, 600,000, option 3, 700,000. And you know when you pick one of the, and that's simply because the cost falls on the Exchequer, and so you either constrain demand or you limit supply. And so we would limit supply. And I was always conscious when I took those decisions in the early years that there was someone with, a great chance in life, with, the right school achievement to go to university, and you are just cutting them off. And that is how our student system has been run for 40 years. And I got rid of the cap. So there's now entirely demand-driven. There can be as many places as you like to meet the demand. And that is because we shifted the basis for funding students, and we moved to a system where you go to university without having to provide any money up front, and then later in life you pay back the cost of that education. You don't pay back that cost of that education if you don't earn above a threshold. I think from memory, although it's been a couple of years since I was doing the job, something like 40% of all the student debt will never be recovered. It's very, very, very progressive. Every independent study done of it by bodies like the Institute for Fiscal Studies says it's one of the most progressive education funding systems in the world. And basically, better off people pay for the undoubted advantage they have of a university degree. And if you don't have that system, if you pay out of taxpayers' money, you are basically asking the person who doesn't go to university, who is earning much less, to pay more in tax to pay for the middle-class person who's going to university. And on top of that, the evidence was that people from low-income backgrounds, the numbers of those people went up and up and up and has reached a record high. So I think, when Jeremy Corbyn says abolish fees, he's basically saying, you, the cleaner, pay more taxes so that you, the lawyer, can go to university, right? And that is anti-progressive. It's a regressive policy. It's also, of course, taken the burden off the taxpayer and public spending, which is your point. Now, public spending actually under the Blair years was around 40 to 41% of GDP, and that was the same under the Thatcher years. So it's been remarkably steady in Britain. It went up to 45% of GDP in the last year before the crash, and then the year after the crash, as Gordon Brown sort of ramped up spending, and then the crash cost the country more in things like welfare. But by the time I left as Chancellor, it was back to 41% of GDP. And I think you'll find there's an interesting fact about Britain, and I suspect this is true of other countries. No government has ever been able to get the proportion of national income that comes in taxation above around 37, 38%. You've had progressive Labour governments, Dennis Healey, the Blair government coming in after all those years of conservatism. They've never been able to get the tax take much higher than 37, 38% of GDP. So by definition, your spending can't be much more than 40%. You can have a little bit higher because in real terms the economy will grow. But it's interesting when people...
It sounds like it doesn't matter who you vote for.
Well, I do think there are some sort of constraints. The biggest problems I had as Chancellor were tax rebellions, right? Not spending. We're talking here about spending. The things that caused me massive problems were taxes that people didn't want to pay, right? Famously on pasties. I wanted to make sure that very wealthy people paid a proportion of. There are some people in Britain who don't pay any income tax. Indeed, their families haven't paid income tax for 50 years, and they're some of the richest people in the country. And they get paid out of capital, and they give away their income to charity. And so I said, let's have 25% of your income paid at least in income tax. It's 25% of your earnings in income tax. And there was they went to these very rich families, and people went to the charities, and all the charities came out against me. It became known as the charities tax, and I was defeated. And at that point, I thought, you know what, you're told to go after very rich people, and when you try, look what happens. I still get more complaints about my stamp duty, which applies to homes worth £2, £3, £4 million, of which there are only about 3. I cut stamp duty for 97% of the country and put it up for 3%. Every day, someone will come up to me and says, your stamp duty is outrageous. Right? Fine, if you're living in a £5 million house, yeah, I was trying to get some money out of you. But it's just so, I just think even when you're trying to kind of tax the rich, you run into constraints, and that constrains the level of spending. And it does. I'm not saying it's always fixed at exactly the same level, but it basically bounces around the same whether you have a Labour or Conservative.
Can I just direct you a bit to the lady's question of sort of the mood around tuition
Well,
fees?
yes,
Even if the system is defensible and actually 9,000, I mean, is obviously a fraction of what you pay often for similar or even less good courses in American universities. So to that extent, I've always considered a bit of a bargain in the international market, but I know that's not always a popular view. Nonetheless, the raw politics, and you mentioned the youth surge for Jeremy Corbyn earlier, tuition fees has become one of those totemic things. You can raise the student sort of body behind it, and if the Conservative Party is looking at a youth quake, doesn't it have to do something about tuition fees, even if it doesn't accept the argument in raw policy terms?
I think bad policy leads to bad politics. And I think we're all sort of chasing this tail now on tuition fees, which will lead to less money for universities. There's no way a Chancellor Exchequer is going to give money to universities over the NHS. So the universities are willing a system where they will be squeezed on funding. Just absolutely, I've sat in that chair. Right, the pressures on you are around the NHS, lots of constraints about welfare, and quite rightly, primary and secondary education. The idea that, Oxford University or London, one of the London universities or, Bristol University is going to be a priority for any chancellor, forget it. And that was the great advance of tuition fees, which, remember, were introduced by a Labour government. They were a progressive act by a Labour government.
Just to be clear, you would advise the government to hold its nerve?
Well, I think hold its nerve. And also, the youth quake, as you describe it, and everyone's described it, the actual evidence from the general election was there was no significant increase in turnout amongst 18 to 25-year-olds. No statistical increase. It's just a total myth. That
those who did were very likely to be.
Well, yeah, but first of all, it's something you get used to as a Conservative. They're not every 19-year-old
right. The next demographic up
is a fan of,
did
But it's also, where Labour got its vote from was people in their 30s and 40s. Right? And I don't believe that they were affected by the kind of alleged pledge to get rid of your student debt. I don't think most people heard that. I think there were other reasons why Labour did well, including the sort of approach being taken by the government to Brexit. But I just think be really careful what you wish for. And in the end, you are going to be introducing a regressive policy. The more you move university funding into the general tax base, the more you're competing against the NHS, and the more other things, and the more you are taxing poorer people to pay for rich people. We did a study which was the 2 British government policies that were the most beneficial to the rich. Right? So where did most of the money go? Richer half the population. And they were tuition fees and free museum entry, right? Both untouchable. And I'm a big fan of our university, our museums, and did a lot to try and support them for what I think are good cultural reasons. But let's not pretend that it's some progressive policy, because it ain't.
I know you're one of the museum directors here today, singing your praises, and an unusual chancellor who gets credit from the arts sector, but you do. Right, let's take a couple of questions over here. Yes, sir.
So, yeah.
Sir one, Sir two. All right, what you
Apologies.
first?
I come from a really, really mixed British background. My mother is from Lincolnshire, Boston, which you'll see there's been changes there. My wife and my children have been brought up in Northern Ireland, and you can guess from my accent I'm from Scotland. My questions are really vague, but nonetheless, it's based around something Nicola Sturgeon said, which is the term nationalist.
Yes.
And the idea of it's now become something which I see, and I've been over here 5 years, this is my 5th year, and I've seen a real change in the United Kingdom. I'd like to know what your thoughts are towards the term nationalist. And is it potentially, I mean, you know, united we stand, divided we fall. And I do worry sometimes when I go back and I see in Boston, in Lincolnshire, in Northern Ireland, and in particular in Scotland, with Brexit, with our idea of independence, and I stand beside and sit beside somebody with a kilt on. You know, there are all those things. What's your thoughts on that? As an editor and also, I suppose, as a previous politician.
Let's take the gentleman in the front, then we'll take the two together. Thank you.
So as a chief executive of a multi-academy trust in the north of England, I think one of your key policies was the Northern Powerhouse, and still is dear to your heart, an attempt to raise productivity in the north of England. So given the theme of this conference, what young people need for 2030 and beyond, what do you think about raising productivity in the north for young people and the role of education in the powerhouse?
Yeah. Well, look, again, the two questions are linked. I mean, I'm not claiming that the whole country should feel the same way that I do, but I am very proud of Britain as a kind of internationalist country, and I'm very proud of the city that I grew up in being, it might be the most international city in the world, which is saying something, but I think it actually is more international than New York, more international than some cities here in the Middle East. And that is a Britain I love, and I think it's true to its heritage. And I think we've been able to bury internal differences and forge a United Kingdom in a way that many other countries were less successful at doing. And we've not had the kind of successionist or, you know, civil war problems that other countries have had for at least for hundreds of years. And actually on Scottish nationalism, and Scotland is really, I suppose, the part of the country I felt had the most sort of distinct identity, maybe also Northern Ireland, but it's a bit more complicated with the relationship with the island of Ireland. You know, Scotland has a different legal system, a different history. I think devolution was a good idea, and I was party to giving it more powers and control. But it does alarm me, the sense of disunity in the country. Now, interestingly, Scottish nationalism is actually on the wane a bit since the Brexit referendum. I mean, you would think it would have been the opposite. But generally, there's just a feeling, you know, of no longer sort of all being, you know, part of the same political entity. And either, you know, I don't know whether Brexit was the symptom of that or the cause of it, but it is certainly magnified. And there's a much stronger feeling of, I think, disunity between the kind of urban areas of the country and the sort of rural, and particularly the kind of provincial industrial towns who feel a bit left behind. And, you know, I always thought that was the kind of next big, we were talking about it before the referendum, the next big mission, because the city centres have been transformed in my lifetime. If you go to Manchester city centre, Leeds city centre, you know, it's amazing and brilliant what's happened over 20 years. But you go to the towns just on the outskirts, the kind of Rochdales and the like, and it's, you know, it doesn't feel like that. And I just see you have to be really careful. You know, if you start pulling apart all the wiring of a nation and dismantling all of its economic and security arrangements with its neighbours, be careful what you wish for. You know, you are entering into unknown territory and throwing away something particularly precious. On the Northern Powerhouse, I mean, I was a Northern Conservative MP, which is quite unusual, certainly when I started as an MP. And, you know, I always thought you could do something about it. There's a kind of resignation, oh, well, you know, the North and the South, there's always going to be a divide, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And I just sort of refused to accept that that was the case, and I thought you could make a determined effort to improve the North of England. I'll give you a smaller example. You know, when I grew up in London, the east of London was very poor, underdeveloped. You would never, you know, the action in the city happened in the west. Now, the action in the city is happening in the east. And you've seen the most incredible regeneration of East London over many miles, not just one district. And I think you could achieve something similar to that in the north through a determined, quite interventionist government plan, not particularly classically conservative, with big investment in infrastructure like the high-speed rail lines, a big attempt to attract investment from the Middle East, from China, which we were doing, and then backing the universities with big sort of showcase science projects in the north, and actually tackling education at the primary and secondary level, where I thought we could do more to promote the academies, which had really started more as a London-based concept and then has more recently spread out. Again, to use another kind of example from London, when I was growing up in the city, or I was privately educated, the London state education system was regarded as one of the very worst in the country. The Inner London Education Authority was a sort of byword for poor management. The schools were sink schools, or many of them were. And what's amazing is the transformation of the London state education system. So you've got many of the best state schools in the country are now in London, and that shows it can be done. A lot of this, by the way, was started under the previous Labour government, so I'm not kind of claiming conservative credit for it, but I think it can be done in the north. I think if you really
can it
focus,
really be done elsewhere though, where
yes.
you have a sort of London is such a great place for sucking in the ambitious. If you're recruiting great teachers. Manchester's a great place to live as well, and
But Manchester, look at the buzz around
there are
Manchester
lots of bits of
compared
Britain
to
that
10
aren't in
years
this
ago.
category. And what is the educational recipe? As the head of an academy's trust, well, you have your own ideas. I come from the northeast of England, for instance. As you rightly point out, I have children in London. I sort of, on the whole, opted for state education with some nervousness, and it feels great. It feels vindicated. I'm not sure that I would feel that living in some parts of the country. I think it's very exciting what's happening in some of the cities in the north. I think Manchester is the kind of probably the outstanding example, but other cities are doing well. I think there's a real buzz. I think there's a feeling amongst professional people that they can spend their whole lives there and make a great success of their careers there, and real industries are growing there, not least the creative industries. And there's been, already a turnaround in some of the inner city schools in Manchester over the last 10 years, particularly the primary schools. Now there are trusts, multi-academy trusts, and big, exciting education projects there. And that's, there I think you've benefited from a very competent and future-thinking council that has been the partner of this for the last 15 years, run by the Labour Party. In other parts of the north, often again in those kind of towns that have been left behind and seaside communities, there is just, it's been, really poor performance in schools, which is, obviously everyone here would care about education while they're here, absolutely tragically letting down people who already are not, starting off with the best start in life. And then even I represented a middle class constituency in Cheshire, and again, I felt the schools, they were obviously, some were better than others. But, there was a kind of, to begin with anyway, when I started off as an MP, a bit of a lack of ambition, that they were kind of okay, middling comprehensives in these towns, and that was fine. And it was only more recently with the education reforms that they started to really try and stretch themselves a bit. It is a sign. You can change things a lot quicker, I think, in education than many people think. Look, we've got loads of questions. Why don't we take a quick, can I just see the clock, please? A quick fire round. That also means probably quick fire answers. Let's take the lady here. Hello.
Hi, I'm from Colombia. I'm sorry, my English.
Sounding good.
It's better than my Spanish.
I have a question about fake news. We have been talking about these past 2 days, about how to strengthening our students and our young people, their critical thinking. Now that you're in a media company and you're a former politician, for you, what's the role about the media company, about the fake news and the education? How can we fight this phenomenon right now?
Good question, thank you. Let's, sorry, got a microphone over here as well, or do we got the one? Someone going to have to sprint. I've got a bit of a feminine bias, but I think we often don't hear a lot from ladies in the audience. It's nice to have so many.
You mentioned earlier that when you're looking at the taxation that goes into schools, it's always competing against other people, in particular the NHS. Now, there you've got waiting lists, you can have people dying in corridors, and that always sucks the attention. In schools, what would have been the canary in the cage for you as a Chancellor to say that more money needed to go into schools?
That's a good question.
Now, do you want to do fake news briefly first, and then
Yeah,
the media, media companies, because it was good to touch
Well,
on
I
that
draw a
before we
distinction.
end.
I think the term fake news is sort of very widely used and quite inaccurately. And of course, you might notice that who's the biggest user of the phrase fake news? Donald Trump. Right? Every tweet is fake news. CNN, fake news. NBC. I don't think when most of us are thinking of fake news, we think CNN's the problem, right? Or we think of all the kind of noise out there that is generated either by malicious actors, other governments, bots, or just sort of conspiracy theorists. And I would draw a distinction between what is clearly inaccurate, like not true. So quite often, the Twitter sphere will erupt with the Queen of England's dead, and she's clearly not, right? So that is a sort of malicious fake news. I think what's different is kind of polarized and partisan arguments in the media between Republicans and Democrats, Brexiteers and Remainers and so on. And there I think there's a different problem. It's not the kind of inaccuracy of the information. It's the sort of selective use of information and the unwillingness to give any airtime to the opposite point of view. Now, I wouldn't say it's a brand new phenomenon. We've grown up, certainly in Britain, with pretty partisan newspapers. But I guess all of these countries used to have big national broadcasters, which was where most people got their information from, or at least millions of people would watch every day. And they often had some kind of commitment to impartiality. So there was a kind of national news source and a national conversation. And as fewer people watch broadcast news and more people move on to get their news from the internet, that feels less so. However, I do feel it's moving in the other direction. I do think Facebook is under enormous pressure now to change the way it delivers news, and that's important. In my country, over 50% of people get their news from Facebook. I think they're now being pushed to only accept more reputable news organizations as their main source of news for their pages, and I think they're going to be called an editor pretty soon by the law, which is something they managed to avoid. So I am actually kind of more encouraged that we're moving in a more positive direction on the kind of more on some of those issues.
Just aware of the clock, can you just do a quickly, the sense of your question being that health tended to trump education when it comes to hard spending decisions, what might change your mind? I think
the first thing to understand with health is that there's a kind of exponential rise in the pressure because the cost of healthcare, people's expectations of what they should get from the health system have risen a lot and continue to rise every year. So the budget is under constant pressure just because of the very alarming kind of rise in health costs. On schools, it's not so obvious. I mean, there'd be sort of trigger events like a teacher's strike or something like that. There'd be more visible sign of discontent in the classroom. But quite often a government, not just a Conservative government, would want to kind of face down industrial unrest. I think if there had been a very marked and rapid deterioration in standards, I think that would have caused a big national debate. As it is, it's still a bit more of a sort of esoteric debate about how Britain does in maths leagues compared to Singapore or whatever, and that doesn't feel as like immediate. Personally, I think investment in education, if you have got £1 of government spending, and assuming you've kind of got your law and order under control, is the best pound you can spend, because I think it's the most likely to generate improvements for the individuals concerned and for the productivity of the country. And without repeating what I said in a previous session, it feels to me the kind of one area where we've not really embraced technology and all the sort of potential change that has provided is education, and not just in Britain but elsewhere. It's beginning to kind of come in at the margins. But a classroom today looks very similar to a classroom 100 years ago, despite it might have a whiteboard and it might be a bit more collaborative. But you really, the country that achieves the kind of big transformative step with applying the new technology to allow teachers to, target their teaching at the appropriate level for each child, I think will be the country that has the great head start.
You've come to the right conference with that message, I think. Time is nearly up. We must touch just very briefly on the international situation and particularly the very worrying standoff with Russia at the moment. Obviously, in the wake of the attempted poisoning of a retired double agent, Mr. Skripal in Britain, Theresa May has taken retaliatory action, and we're now seeing the same coming back from Russia and from Vladimir Putin. I was thinking of you, or thought of you when you were doing politics, being rather on the hawkish side of arguments, quite tough in terms of your international outlook. Do you think we have the response to this too soft, too hard, or Goldilocks as right as it can be, given the complexity of the situation?
Well, when you say hawkish, which I would sort of accept, what I really mean is we shouldn't be embarrassed about our values. And then you can call them Western values, you can call them human rights, you can call them whatever you like, but we should stop being embarrassed to say democracy is a good thing, free speech is a good thing, freedom of the press is a good thing, the right to an education is a good thing, right? And so what if another country says, well, who are you to come and tell us this? And, these are things worth fighting for, in my view. When it comes to the situation in Britain at the moment, it sounds almost sort of fantastical to say it, but 2 weeks ago, almost certainly, the Kremlin, or elements connected with the Kremlin, attempted to assassinate a man and his daughter, in public, using a chemical weapon for the first time since the Second World War, the use of a chemical weapon in Britain, in Europe, and using an extremely rare nerve agent, which was developed by the KGB to assassinate people. And it's kind of incredible that happened, but it did. Now, the question is, what on earth do you do in response to it? It's not the first time it's happened in Britain. There was an assassination using radioactive material 10 years ago in central London. What do you do in response? Well, you can't go to war. I don't think that would be very well advised. So everything, there's always going to be, it's always going to be somewhat constrictive what you can do. But I think the package that Theresa May has put forward is a strong one about expelling diplomats, dramatically cooling bilateral relations, boycotting the World Cup in terms of our official delegation presence, not the football team, which we didn't do in 1980 in the Moscow Olympics, even though the United States boycotted it, and additional financial sanctions against individuals and Russian entities. And she's got to think, well, as I'm clear she is, the Russians are going to retaliate and we might have to retaliate back, so you need some more shots in your locker, and you've got to have thought that through before you embark on this course. But as I say, short of going to war, in the end, Russia can, say, well, who cares, and we're not listening, and so on. But it continues the isolation of the Russian regime, which, is a tragedy, in my view, for the people of Russia, and not great for the world. But, if you've got leaders who are prepared to carry out assassinations in other countries, that's
fascinating, turbulent world, isn't it? Good for newspaper editors, if not always good for those at their sharp end. You're back to your desk tomorrow morning?
I will be at the news conference at 8 in the morning in London.
But take a look at the front page and see what you've decided to put on it. George Osborne.
Well, maybe a London teacher is going to win a big prize. We
let's
don't know.
Is it too late to affect the voting?
Well, I haven't got a vote, I don't think so.
No, I don't think either of us have the vote on that one. We're just rooting.
That's a good news story that we would. I think actually this conference, talking about education, the way this conference is working to try and, introduce glamour and recognition around teaching is brilliant, and makes it, if you're a newspaper editor, teacher wins $1 million prize is a great headline. Absolutely.
We're all fascinated to see who it's going to be and whoever we're rooting for tonight. So
I'm rooting for the Londoner.
You're definitely you're just after your front page, aren't you? George Osborne, politician, newspaper editor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.